In this short segment, we will talk about research questions and hypotheses. Every study that is conducted in communication is guided either by a research question or several research questions, or by a hypothesis or several hypotheses. Research questions and hypotheses are simply tools that tell us what we're looking for and that help us focus our research. We will begin with research questions, and research question is what I want you to ask in your research paper at the end of the semester. So all you need to do is come up with a single research question that will guide your study that you are designing. A research question simply is a question that is to be answered through a research study. It may or may not be informed by prior research. This means that we may already know a lot about a topic that we're studying, and we are just asking a new question on that topic, or it may be a question about a completely new area. So I will give you an example. For example, we know a lot about the influence of watching violent programming, such as action movies or horror movies, on people's reactions. But perhaps little research has been done on the reactions of elderly people or seniors to this type of content. And so a researcher could design a study that would be guided by the research questions such as, how do seniors respond to violent movie content, for instance? So this question is informed by prior research, meaning that we already know that people generally have some negative effects from watching violent content, but it's curious to see whether there are any specific unique characteristics of these reactions depending on the age group that a person is. And so let's say we could look at seniors in this particular example. On the other hand, there are areas of communication that are very new and we really don't know very much about them. So for instance, blogging and video blogging is a very new development that is only a few years old. And there is still very little research about how people use blogging, how they respond to it, what role it plays in their lives. So a researcher could ask a question such as, what is the effect of running a web blog on a person's levels of self-esteem and self-perceptions, for example? In other words, you could ask a question about, how does blogging make blogs authors feel about themselves? Or Twitter is a very new occurrence, and there's really little we could compare twittering to. So it would be very interesting to see why people tweet, and so why people use Twitter and why people post updates about themselves online. So you could ask a research questions, what are the motives for which people use Twitter? That would be a brand new research question, and there's not a whole lot of research on similar things that we could really base this off of. And research questions are asked both in qualitative and quantitative research studies. So both studies that use statistics and large groups of participants or samples, and also studies that rely on in-depth analysis of just a few cases or just a few pieces of work that we look at, a few documents. Here are some examples of research questions that have been asked in communication research. What percentage of children's cartoons depict acts of violence? By the way, can you guess what percentage it is? If you guessed 80%, you're correct. Isn't that staggering? Why do people self-disclose on viral video sites? This is one of those questions that probably couldn't be backed with a whole lot of research. Is self-disclosure related to a relational satisfaction? Does exposure to a product advertisement affect purchasing behavior? What is the relationship between political ideology and the use of bumper stickers? So as you can see, these questions are fairly precise, very concrete and to the point, and in each question you state one particular relationship or process or problem that you are interested in. So this is what I will want you to do when you design your research study. I will want you to propose a new research question in the topic that you are interested in. And then we have hypotheses. A hypothesis is simply an educated guess. We propose hypotheses in quantitative research mostly. Rarely do we do that in qualitative research. So the hypotheses are proposed usually in research that uses statistics and that relies on large numbers of participants. A hypothesis predicts a relationship between two or more variables. Variables are things that vary, such as eye color, temperature, level of self-esteem, amount of money somebody makes. All of these things vary, and they could be related to each other, or people could differ from each other on some kind of variable. For instance, some people are taller than others. And like I said, hypotheses are educated guesses. That means that a hypothesis cannot be just advanced out of the blue. It has to be grounded in past research evidence. And so when I predict that people self-disclose on viral video websites because they have an inherent need of sharing with another human being, that should be backed by some research, maybe in the area of self-disclosure in general, that would confirm that hunch, so to speak. So the hypothesis cannot be proposed just out of the blue. It has to be an educated guess. You have to have some information, some data from previous research studies that tell you that this is most likely what's going on here. A really important characteristic is that a hypothesis has to be falsifiable. In other words, it has to be stated in such a way that it could be rejected. So, for example, if you state a hypothesis like this: people exposed to frightening media content may or may not react with fear. I mean, it's a fair statement, but it's not a hypothesis because it's always true. A hypothesis has to be falsifiable. In other words, it has to be phrased in such a way that it could be rejected. But because you say that people either may or may not respond with fear, this hypothesis will always be supported. So look at this one. Is this hypothesis falsifiable? Physical attractiveness of a job candidate will or will not affect hiring decisions. Once again, it will always be true, because in some cases maybe the attractiveness will affect hiring decisions, in some others it will not. So it's impossible to reject this hypothesis in any situation. So that's not a well-phrased hypothesis. A useful hypothesis is falsifiable, so it is possible for it to be wrong. So you either should say physical attractiveness of a job candidate will affect hiring decisions, or physical attractiveness of a job candidate will not affect hiring decisions. Each of those two versions are falsifiable. In other words, it is possible, at least in theory, for there to be circumstance in which this hypothesis will be incorrect. And then hypotheses can be divided into four kinds depending on whether they are specifying a relationship between variables or a difference among groups, and whether they are non-directional or directional. So whether they are specifying the direction of the relationship or the direction of the difference. So let's first look at the hypotheses of relationship. Hypotheses of relationship simply specify that two variables are related to each other. In this one, there is a relationship between one's need for affiliation and the likelihood of joining a high school clique. And another example of a relationship hypothesis: the higher one's need for affiliation, the greater the likelihood of joining a clique. Both hypotheses specify that the need for affiliation and likelihood of joining a high school clique, the two variables, are somehow related to each other. Hypotheses of difference, in turn, talk about how groups of people or groups of things differ from each other on some kind of variable. So for instance, cheerleaders and emos differ in the amount of black they wear. In case you're wondering, I got the inspiration for these examples from a conversation with my young cousin who is in high school, and we talked about the different cliques that people are in. So that's why. Here's another example of a hypothesis of difference. Emos wear more black than do cheerleaders. So again, it says that one group has more of something than the other. The two groups are different. Now you noticed probably that these two hypotheses of relationship and these two hypotheses of difference somehow differ from each other. We have non-directional hypotheses and directional hypotheses. Non-directional hypotheses tell us that there is a relationship or there is a difference, but it doesn't specify in what direction that relationship or difference moves. So in this case it says there is a relationship between one's need for affiliation and the likelihood of joining a high school clique, but it doesn't tell us, is it a positive relationship, a negative relationship? Do these two things increase together, or does one increase and the other decrease? So it doesn't tell us the direction of the relationship, and so it's a non-directional hypothesis. This one here is also non-directional. It tells us that there is a difference between cheerleaders and emos in the amount of black they wear, but it doesn't tell us the direction of this difference, so it does not tell us who wears more black, who wears less black. The directional hypothesis does specify the difference and its direction. The higher one's need for affiliation here, the greater the likelihood of joining a clique. So here it tells us that as the need affiliation increases, so does the likelihood of joining a clique. So this is a positive relationship, and so that is a direction that is specified. In this other example here, this also is a directional hypothesis that states that emos wear more black than do cheerleaders. So it specifies in what direction that difference between these two groups moves. In this case, we have emos who wear more black than cheerleaders. When you're done with this video, I would like you to move on to a couple of activities that are listed in this section of Blackboard.